Hi there, and thanks for joining me for this episode of Healthytarian Living. Today we are going to be exploring the food known as quinoa, and this is going to be part of the Healthytarian Living series, guides and tutorials, which you can find on healthytarian.com. And so today we are going to learn all about how to work with quinoa, how to prepare it, how to cook it, how to use it in meals, and most importantly, why. And the why is really going to revolve around the fact that it is one of those really nutrient dense and superior high quality food sources. And so to start with, we'll cover a little bit about the description of quinoa. If you are not familiar with quinoa yet, it is one of the tiniest seeds, although there is smaller, and it is typically described as being off-white, creamy, or light beige in color, though several colored varieties exist. Quinoa is native to the Andean region, and this is really where it originated in these parts of South America. Now today, quinoa can be found growing in other parts of the world as well, including my local country, Canada. From what we know, it was domesticated about 3,000 to 4,000 years ago and has been since used by cultures, especially in South America, and has no doubt been a part of some of their optimal health successes. With respect to its botanical aspect, quinoa is referred to as a seed grain. It is not part of the grass grain family, nor is it a cereal grain. And so this is one of the things actually that right off the bat makes quinoa gluten-free. And this is one of the reasons also why quinoa has risen in popularity recently, especially as more people have experienced various degrees of gluten sensitivity as well as gluten intolerance. We also know that quinoa is, generally speaking, non-allergenic, and it is low compared to other foods who tend to set off or be more of a high risk with respect to allergies. And it is also quite easy to digest, so it also has a high digestibility factor. With respect to quinoa's nutrition, it is, as I mentioned to you in the introduction, one of those superior foods. We can call it a superfood, but really, as we learn more and more about our whole plant foods, which is the foundation of the healthitarian lifestyle, we learn that they all have some superior and really outstanding nutritional and health benefits. And this is why we want to base our diets on them. And so what you will find in 1 cup of cooked quinoa, which would be a typical serving for most people, we will find about 220 calories. And these are nutrient dense, nutrient packed calories. Quinoa's macronutrient profile is one of those what can be considered near perfect profiles. About 70% of its calories come from optimally healthy carbohydrates, which are our body's top fuel when they come from real whole food sources like this, not processed or refined grain and carbohydrate like foods. About 15% of its calories come from protein, which is right in that ideal range of getting about 10 to 15% of our calories from protein. And about 15% of its calories are also attributed to fats. And of course, as you can imagine, being a whole plant food, these are optimally healthy fats, mostly unsaturated fats. And out of those, lots of attributes when it comes to being supportive for various aspects of our cardiovascular system and heart health. When it comes to the vitamins, quinoa is specifically rich, like most seeds, true seeds, whether it's, seeds or nuts or grains or even beans, in the B vitamins. It's especially rich in folate, but also includes vitamin B1, B2, B6, some B3, and it also has some vitamin E, which is a really nice addition, as this provides us with not just antioxidant benefits, but also various protective and supportive benefits for our cardiovascular system, heart health, and even skin, and other areas of our health. When it comes to minerals, quinoa is an exceptional source of these, as are all the true seeds, as I've just mentioned to you. And it is especially high in ones like manganese, but also includes good amounts of magnesium and copper, and phosphorus, includes some iron and zinc and potassium and selenium, and even includes some calcium. Now, aside from the macro and micronutrients, quinoa is an outstanding source, like all whole plant foods, of phytonutrients. And remember, we want variety in our diet, and this is why we want to include something like quinoa, because as we enjoy the different variations of whole plant foods, then we get to enjoy all of the different and powerful benefits that come from their respective phytonutrients. We know these have really powerful value when it comes to our health. And quinoa specifically is a rich source of flavonoids, which optimally support, again, our cardiovascular system, are protective against major chronic conditions, including cancers and such, also support just general vitality and longevity. Many of quinoa's phytonutrients have antioxidant properties or benefits, and so that also beneficially supports our health, from immune health to, again, being protective, preventative against cancers. Some of its phytonutrients also include ones like saponins, and you may have heard of these as they are present in various plant foods and tend to have a little bit of a bitter nature to them. And so we'll be talking more about those when we talk about preparation and cooking of quinoa. Ultimately, quinoa has very powerful anti-inflammatory benefits. And again, this is for many of its nutritional reasons that we've just finished mentioning. So all in all, it is a really smart food to include, whether you are trying to protect your body and health, whether you are trying to prevent the major chronic conditions, anything from diabetes type 2 to, again, various aspects of heart disease, high blood pressure, cholesterol, to cancers, to running our immune system optimally and really supporting every organ, tissue, and cell in the best of ways. And so it's definitely a food that we can feel really good about including as part of our regular diet. When it comes to buying your quinoa, especially if this is your first time, where should you begin? Well, today quinoa is widely available throughout North America, South America, of course, and is making its way to other parts of the world as well. So check your local grocery store, your local natural health food store, as most likely it is already there. You can also, of course, utilize the many online options where you can buy foods from. You can find quinoa also in your bulk food store, as well as local food co-ops. The most important thing, of course, is you want to have the highest quality quinoa possible. And while, at least right now, quinoa is not threatened by any genetic engineering or genetic modification, it is still a really good idea to buy organic quinoa. Remember, the healthier the farming method was, the more it supports us nutritionally, but the more it also supports our planet. And so organic quinoa is always a good idea. And of course, buying fresh quinoa. So be mindful if you are buying from open bulk bins in terms of how quickly that quinoa is turned over so that it is not sitting there for long periods of time. The best way to store your quinoa is to keep it, of course, in sealed containers. You can transfer a bulk amount, especially when it comes in something like 5-pound or 10-pound or bigger bags, and bottle it, for example, as I like to do, in various reusable jars. So making sure that it's tightly sealed, and this way you can have your quinoa sit for a year, if not longer. Preferably in a cool and dry spot, that would be best. But what we know about quinoa so far is that unlike other seeds or nuts, it is not as prone to oxidation. In terms of storing cooked quinoa, it will keep in the fridge for several days. Usually about 3 days, even sometimes 4 to 5 days can work, as long, of course, as you are using clean utensils to remove the necessary amounts as you prepare your meals. Sometimes people ask, can I freeze cooked quinoa? And yes, absolutely, you can do that. Although I find that quinoa is so quick and so easy to cook that fresh, again, or freshly cooked as much as possible really is best. And you can cook a big batch at a time and, again, have it last at least for the majority of the week. And then you can quickly make your meals very efficient by just adding some cooked quinoa to some of the meals we'll be talking about later on. So next, let's talk about preparation methods for your quinoa. So quinoa comes as a dry seed, and that's typically how it is sold. Now, from here, we have several options. The main two routes, though, to take would be either soaking and sprouting your quinoa to keep it fully raw, or you can, of course, do a variation of that and then cook your quinoa. Now, what we've also learned thus far about quinoa is that cooking, such as simmering it after boiling your water, isn't as destructive to it as it would be, for example, to many of the other whole plant foods. If you'd like to go the sprouting method, then there are lots of resources, for example, whether written or video ones, that you can look up on the internet and see which method resonates with you the most. But typically, we would be soaking our quinoa first for some extended period of time. Sometimes people do it for as little as 30 minutes, sometimes up to about 6 to 8 hours, and then rinsing, draining, rinsing really well, and then starting the sprouting process. And the sprouting can take anywhere from about 1 to 3 days, on average. And then that quinoa can be consumed, assuming again, it's been rinsed along the way appropriately. And that kind of quinoa can again be kept in the fridge and keep well for several days, again, making sure that you keep it in appropriate containers. Now, with respect to the cooking method, we have a few ways that we can enter this. We can either soak our quinoa first, which is always a good idea to do with all seeds, grains, beans, nuts, etc. Soaking it here can be for as little as 15 minutes up to several hours, and then draining all that water, rinsing really well, and proceeding to cooking. Either way, even if you don't soak your quinoa, being that it is easy to digest and gluten-free and all that, we can proceed to simply rinsing the quinoa and cooking it. For the most part, we'd like to definitely rinse the quinoa. One of those phytonutrient groups, the saponins, for example, they tend to have, as I mentioned, a bitter flavor. So sometimes people eat their quinoa and say, well, I don't really like it, or I had a bad experience, I don't want to try it again. But what I recommend is definitely make sure that you prepare your own quinoa, rinse it properly, if not soak it for some time, to release. The saponins are water soluble and they will get released under some really good either rinsing or as part of a little bit of soaking. And so that tends to change quinoa's flavor slightly and make it more, well, pleasantly just neutral. Sometimes people describe it as very gently sweet or a little bit nutty. So that can also be improved upon. Now, when it comes to cooking our quinoa, the ratios for your dry quinoa to water, I've come across anything from a 1-to-1 ratio to a 1-to-2 ratio, 1 parts quinoa to 2 parts water. And what I've found is that a 1 to 1.5 ratio works best. And this is my recommendation. This is how I cook my quinoa, and every single time enjoy, perfectly cooked quinoa. My usual amount is to cook 2 cups of dry quinoa, in which case I will be using 3 cups of water. And this makes a really nice serving for several days, and again makes your meal time and your cooking time more efficient. So consider cooking a little extra, and that way again you can help yourself to make really quick, efficient meals from wholesome plant foods. So after you soak and drain and rinse, or simply rinse your quinoa, bring the appropriate amount of water to a boil, and once it starts to boil, add in your quinoa, stir it around, and then reduce the heat to simmer. And set a timer, this is always the key to having perfectly cooked quinoa, for 15 minutes. And how do you know your quinoa is done? Because all of the water has absorbed. So just like when we cook rice, there's no need to stir the quinoa while it is cooking. Simply cover the pot with a lid and leave it like that until the timer goes off. When you hear the timer go off, then examine your quinoa, especially this is easy to do if you have see-through lids, and something I'm always a big fan of when it comes to getting proper cookware. So examine it, see if all the water looks like it has absorbed. If not, give it another minute or two and that should do it. And then turn off the heat and remove the quinoa from the heat. You can let it sit for several minutes, you can fluff it with a fork, and that's it. You can then proceed to use it fresh in a meal, or let it cool off and store it in the fridge for your next meal with quinoa. So now that we know how optimally nutritious quinoa is, and therefore great for our overall health, as well as how weight friendly it is, and we know how we are going to buy it and store it and cook it, how are we going to use the quinoa as part of our meals? Well, the good news is quinoa is so versatile, and again, usually its flavor is neutral enough that it can go as part of any meal that you like. Whether you want a meal on a sweeter side, on a sour or spicy or savory side, quinoa is super versatile and can go pretty much with anything. And so for breakfast, you can swap perhaps your usual bowl of oatmeal or steel cut oats or teff or kamut or whatever perhaps morning whole grain that you are eating or using, and try quinoa. You can add in some soaked nuts to it, or some soaked seeds, or some fresh berries or another fruit, some coconut. You can make your own almond milk and mix it around in there. So the possibilities are endless in terms of what you're going to most enjoy. When it comes to lunch or dinner, you can add quinoa to soups, you can add quinoa to salads, and one of my favorite ways to use quinoa in salads is the quinoa tabbouleh salad, and you can find that video whether on YouTube under the Healthytarian channel or on healthytarian.com in the recipes section. You can add quinoa to various stir fries, sautés, steam mixes, as I like to call them, and that's another one of my favorite ways to use it. You can simply make a bed of it on your plate and then add the different sautéed or steamed or stir-fried veggies and mushrooms to it, or you can mix it all together and make a meal out of it. And I prefer the former method when my quinoa is freshly cooked, and the latter method when I have some quinoa already cooked and just need to steam or saute some veggies and mushrooms, and then add the quinoa to it, stir it around, add some herbs and spices, and you have a beautiful, delectable meal in just, again, a few minutes. Now, what else you can do with quinoa is you can add it to smoothies. Some people like adding cooked quinoa to smoothies, but what else is really neat, and something I've recently decided to try, is to use quinoa flour in smoothies, because it can actually be added in its raw form. And see how you may enjoy perhaps giving some variety to your hopefully green smoothies and making them even more nutritionally dense. It does not change or alter the taste of the smoothie. Again, here I'm referring specifically to green smoothies. And as I mentioned to you in the introduction as well, today we can make quinoa a more sustainable product by becoming more of a local product. And so, for example, I found some Canadian quinoa. So quinoa grown in the Canadian prairies. Now, some people will also wonder, what about baking with quinoa flour? And if you do want to bake something, then yes, you can use some quinoa flour, although keep in mind that it being gluten-free, it will not be a perfect substitute for typical grass grain gluten-based flours. And so you're going to have to look for specifically quinoa-based recipes or know how to work with it so that your recipe, of course, turns out as it's intended. So ultimately, wherever you would use perhaps something like brown rice or buckwheat, you can swap quinoa in, cooked quinoa, for example, or sprouted quinoa, and enjoy that as part of any meal. Now, besides the quinoa flour that I mentioned to you, there are also other quinoa products on the market today, such as quinoa pasta. And this is again due to the growing demand of gluten-free needs or products in our society. Quinoa, if it's pure quinoa pasta, that can be a much better choice, for example, than any, of course, white wheat or even regular whole wheat, but not organic. So experiment with that if you do choose to use any pasta in your diet. But remember that whole as much as possible is best, or minimally processed, and trying not to go into any of the heavily processed quinoa foods. So be smart with how you use the whole plant food. The more processed it gets, the more we lose, the more we miss out, and the more we introduce other unfavorable characteristics. And so I hope you enjoyed this introduction and guide to using quinoa, understanding that it is a superior whole plant food and one that we can comfortably use and include as part of optimally healthy living and eating. And quinoa is very easy to work with, whether it is its cooking method or the different versatility that it provides to our meals. I hope you enjoy working with quinoa. If you haven't tried it already, I definitely recommend that you give it a try. And if you have tried it or have some of your favorite recipes with quinoa that are optimally healthy, then feel free to include those in the comments below. Thanks for joining me today, and see you next time.